Brian, biggest takeaways?
Hi, Rochelle. Yeah, no, a very busy press conference that just unfolded. One of these situations where the statement didn't really yield all that much. That was surprising, but the press conferences where we heard the commentary, the Fed chairman saying that the Federal Reserve will make appropriate monetary policy in this uncertain environment. And we know that the policy statement added China as a risk to the economic outlook. That is because of the COVID-related shutdowns, because of the zero COVID policy in the world's second largest economy. The Fed chairman saying, though, with regards to inflation, we know that inflation is at yearly pacing at levels we haven't seen since the early 1980s. But the Fed chairman said that he does not expect or does not see a wage price spiral, at least for right now. Translation, things likely aren't to get up to speed to the double-digit inflation that we saw in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Of course, history will bear that out in the next couple months or perhaps years. But what was interesting was whether or not the Fed chairman was going to take even more aggressive moves off the table in future meetings. Obviously, that 50 basis point move today was the most aggressive single meeting move that we've seen since May of 2000. The Fed chairman asked if perhaps a 75 basis point move could be on the table. Take a listen to what he said earlier.
75 basis point in an increase is not something the committee is actively considering. What we are doing is we raised 50 basis points today, and we've said that, again, assuming that economic and financial conditions evolve in ways that are consistent with our expectations, there's a broad sense on the committee that additional 50 basis point increases should be on the table for the next couple of meetings. So we're going to make those decisions at the meetings, of course, and we'll be paying close attention to the incoming data.
So the Fed chairman laying out pretty clearly, at least right there, that a 75 basis point move is not going to be on the table, at least in the near term. Instead, it's going to be a 50 basis point, that half point move, that will be on the table in the, quote, next couple of meetings. Keep in mind that would be in June and then in July. Now, obviously, a lot of concerns over what the inflationary picture is going to look like at that point. But again, the Fed chairman saying that the economy looks poised to be able to handle and absorb those interest rate hikes. Now, of course, the next meeting is going to be in another 6 weeks from now, and a lot could change between now and then, guys.
Hey, Brian, what did you make of the tone of the meeting? Because when we started this, or when Jay Powell started this, he started the presser by saying, I want to speak directly to the American people. He's saying that the FOMC is acutely aware that high inflation means hardship. This isn't necessarily the way that these things typically kick off.
No, and that's an important point that you bring up. We hear the Fed chairman usually begin these press conferences by saying the Federal Reserve is paying attention and is, attentive to the American experience in the economy. But he doesn't start off with the literal words, I would like to speak to the American people, and that caught a lot of attention. It underscores just how severe the inflationary picture is in the United States. It's no surprise that Americans are feeling this, especially those on the lower wage, in many cases also minority households. Now, the Fed chairman was saying, look, we're going to do whatever we can to try to use our blunt tools to make sure that we can take inflation back down. And that led to a number of questions in the last hour over how the Fed chairman plans on doing that. And I had the chance to ask the Fed chairman about the Volcker experience, obviously referring to the Paul Volcker-led Fed of the late 1970s, early 1980s, when he dramatically raised interest rates to tamp down on runaway inflation. Now, yes, it was successful in taking inflation back down, but also came with a lot of pain because higher borrowing costs really abruptly ended American consumption and business investment, things that rely on borrowing. And when it comes to the lived experiences that were had through that time, it was definitely not fun, although it did ultimately achieve that outcome. But the Fed chairman saying, quote, there may be some pain associated with getting back to 2% inflation, but said ultimately the bigger pain is not dealing with the inflation that we're facing now. So a bit of a tightrope that the Federal Reserve is walking.
Brian, it's exactly what I wanted to ask you about, because Michael Cox, who we're going to get back to in a moment, former chief economist of the Dallas Fed, said there's too much Paul Volcker admiration and not enough emulation. Is that the consensus you're hearing out there, that he's not emulating Volcker enough?
Well, I mean, there could be an argument that he doesn't want to do exactly what Paul Volcker was doing because that triggered a recession. That's why they call it in the economic textbooks a Volcker shock. The idea is that the Federal Reserve feels like in this case, in this scenario, that's what the Fed chairman was saying over the last hour, they feel confident they can get a soft, or as the Fed chairman just said, a soft-ish landing. What that would imply is that the Fed could slowly ratchet interest rates up in increments of 25, in increments of 50, remains to be seen if it's going to be in increments larger than that, to eventually take the economy to a place where growth will certainly be lower than trend in 2021, because that was an extraordinary circumstance post-pandemic. Unemployment rate could indeed go higher, but hopefully not at levels that would be at the double digits that we certainly saw in the 1980s, the early 1980s. Obviously, this is very ambitious. This is in many ways perhaps a bit aspirational, but the Federal Reserve is saying, look, at this time we have some market confidence, because you could see in market pricing that there's not quite expectations of inflation running away, at least right now, that they can pull this off. But of course, history will have to bear that out, and that makes the next few months and next few years very critical.
We didn't stop at end-to-end IT solutions.